Thank you everyone for joining. We'll start in a minute. I'm just giving people 1 more minute to join. Thank you. So we are about there. We'll start in a few seconds. Okay, I think we have quite a number of people, so we are gonna start. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to today's webinar on fire for water. It's sure an interesting topic and the first time for this network to host one. It's a pleasure to be your host for this session. My name is Florence Mugi and I work as the network manager with the Nature Conservancy. So before we jump in, have a few housekeeping items to help us keep things running smoothly today. So I'll share my screen. So just a heads up that this webinar is being recorded and this recording will be shared afterward on the Resilient Watersheds toolbox for anyone who may want to revisit it. We'll also be sharing the recording after the webinar on your emails, so you can be on the lookout for that. So the session is being hosted in English, and you can enable your transcription to be able to view transcription in another language. So to just keep things going and keep the background noise down, everybody is muted, but please do not hesitate to engage with us through the chat button. You can also drop your questions on the Q&A button, which is enabled for all the participants. And you just let us know what questions you have for the panelists today. And in the question, you can include your name and organization. So, all right, let's get started. So in terms of our agenda today, we have 4 presentations from amazing speakers for today. We'll start with this welcoming that I'm doing right now and a quick poll to just get ourselves introduced. Then we'll move into our first presentation from Matt, who is working with Living Rats in South Africa and going to focus on prescribed bans and wildfire response. After that, we'll head to New Mexico, where we'll hear from the Rio Grande Waterford team. Jason and Will are here with us on some of their collaborative approaches to fire management. We'll then shift to Blue Forest, where Morrison will be sharing their perspective and focusing more on conservation finance and corrective action. And to add the presentations, we'll have a presentation from the Greater Cape Town Waterford on invasive species control through fire. Castin is with us today. So we have built in some time for discussion at the end. So we'll have a dedicated Q&A, and we are going to encourage you to share your questions on the Q&A button. We'll have our panelists answer them as we go along and also respond to some of the questions during the Q&A via a voiceover. So, but before we start with our first speaker, let's get to know each other through a poll. so that you can let us know you are joining us and where you are joining us from. All we require is for you to type your country on that link. Caro is going to paste the link on the chat, or you can just use your phone to scan the QR code that is on your screen. Alternatively, you can go to menti.com and enter the code that is in yellow, highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the screen. Thank you, Caro. So the link is on the chat. So just type the country you are joining us from. So I'll just give it a second. So that you can put that in. Don't be shy. Please let us know you are joining us and where you are joining us from. So 10 more seconds. Let me share with all of you so that you're also able to see how many countries are joining us today. Very colorful slide. So thank you everyone for sharing this with us. We really appreciate you joining us today. So without further ado, please also you can introduce yourself on the chat. I see some people have already done that. And on the chat, you can put your name, where you're joining us from in terms of organization and also your country as well. So you can also introduce yourself on the chat. Amazing. So I would like now to invite our first speaker, who is Matt Sefton. Matt is a landscape coordinator at Living Lands, South Africa, with over 10 years of experience in implementing and managing large-scale ecosystem restoration projects in Lagclough. He specializes in sustainable wild honeybush utilization and fire management, bringing practical on-ground expertise to complex landscape challenges. As an Eastern Cape farmer, he understands the realities of land management firsthand and applies these insights to balance ecological priorities with working landscape needs. So Matt is with us today, and Matt, I'll share my screen once again. And you can just maybe share something about yourself that I might have missed on your introduction.
Thank you very much, Flo. Thanks for that introduction and the opportunity to speak here today. Thank you to everyone for making the time to join this webinar. I think it's incredibly important to be talking about fire management at scale. So as Flo said, I'm Matt Sefton, the landscape coordinator for the Lagclough landscape. I work for Living Lands, an NPC that works with large-scale land rehabilitation in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. And we work predominantly, at least my landscape, in a vegetation type called fynbos. It's quite a well-known one within the Cape Floristic region. And fire is not only a natural process in the fynbos, but it's really its defining force. But across much of the Cape Floristic region, that relationship between fire and landscapes has become unbalanced. We have suppressed fire in some places, and we've had lots of unplanned and unmanaged fires, which are increasingly feared and misunderstood. Hence the need to have these kinds of webinars and actually discuss fire management at a larger scale. So today's talk, I'm going to argue that proactive and well-managed fire is not only ecologically necessary, but it's also economically sensible, especially in the context of invasive plants, which are not only a South African phenomenon, significantly affecting our dwindling water supplies within the climate uncertainty that we currently face. So the presentation I'll have today explores what successful fire management looks like in practice. It breaks down the real costs of prescribed burns, the planning, the preparation, the coordination of them, and it weighs them against the long-term benefits of healthier catchments, reduced fire risk, improved water yields, and enhanced biodiversity. And importantly, we look at what conditions are required for fire management to succeed, from clear legislation to competent implementing agencies, landowner cooperation, and skilled crews, as well as the careful coordination and favorable weather, which is not always on our side. It will also challenge the perception that prescribed burns are too risky or too expensive to implement at scale. And that is really the take-home message that I would like everyone to hear. And to unlock healthier catchments, we really must restore natural fire regimes or fire rhythms. And this means moving beyond the emergency response that we currently have towards a integrated and proactive regime that works with rather than against the natural dynamics, specifically in the fynbos biome that we are currently operating in. So we see fire as a force for good. Fynbos is fire dependent, as I've said, as a vegetation type. But fire is not merely natural in the fynbos, it's essential. Without fire, the fynbos dies. And today our relationship with fire is fractured. So why is that? You can go to the next slide, Florence. We have the unraveling of a natural relationship. There's been decades of fire suppression without much thought going into when we should allow fires to burn. Urban expansion and liability fears around the legislation related to fire in South Africa. And that has resulted in a vastly overaged felt in some places, a vast buildup of fuel loads, and massively this invasive spread. Pine trees, wattles, so acacias, as well as eucalyptus, all of which burn incredibly hot and unnaturally in the fynbos system. And this has resulted in some very, very large megafires. And the irony is, while fynbos needs fire for its health, it doesn't need just any fire. It needs the right kind of fires at the right times, burning in the right ways. Next slide, please. So I'll quickly touch on a case study that we have utilized as a bit of a seeding moment in the Langkloof, which is the Jobertina Dam case study. So this is a dam that provides the vast majority of water for the town of Jobertina. It's in the Watersheds catchment in the Langkloof Valley in the Eastern Cape. And it really is the lifeline of our small town. The problem, next slide, is that we have a massively dense pine infestation within this key catchment. It threatens the local water supply, and there is just no funding currently for invasive removal of those pines through manual clearing methods, although it has been tried in the past. But we've had two wildfires in the vicinity, which resulted in an opportunity that we couldn't pass by. 2 years of planning has culminated in a successful prescribed burn that aimed specifically at controlling the invasive vegetation in just a small part of the catchment, but one that was quite risky to have done without those two other wildfires and the opportunities that they resulted in. There was a lot of preparation, fire breaks, ignition lines, permits were applied for, resources for risk mitigation and aerial resources were achieved. And essentially, we needed vast stakeholder buy-in in order to conduct this prescribed burn. So what are the results of that prescribed burn? You can go through, thank you. We were able to kill well over 80% of the mature pine trees within the area that we wanted to burn, with the remaining mature pines killed physically through either ring barking or felling with chainsaws. There was a vastly reduced wildfire risk due to fuel load reduction. There was improved catchment water yields, and it opened the space for fynbos regeneration. But this was only the first step. The regeneration and follow-up clearing was essential. We know that burning pine infestations in these areas result in mass germination events, making follow-up essential. So one of our take-homes for this area is that if you don't have a plan for follow-up and long-term follow-up, rather don't start with a fire. This is the first step for us in a 21, 22-year plan. And we really need those secondary and tertiary burns and follow-ups to make this successful. Otherwise, it simply makes the problem bigger. Next slide, please. So what are the economics of this? What are the costs versus the consequences? Yes, fire costs a lot of money, planning, labor, equipment, permits, contingency funds, making sure that we're in the right weather windows. But what are the costs of not burning? Severe damage to infrastructure from the inevitable wildfires that occur from the buildup of unnatural fuel loads and invasive trees, the degradation of the catchments and water insecurity, the long-term alien clearing fatigue, and that really affects us in our job when we really don't see these small wins and we only seem to be losing this fight. Sometimes it's really important to have small battles that we actually do see the consequences or the results of. Catastrophic wildfires, which have been occurring recently, and critically, the loss of fynbos biodiversity, which is essential. Next slide, please. But we see fire as a return of investment. The cost of avoided degradation in catchments must also be looked at. So we understand that it improves catchment function. We understand that it reduces alien load and increases the health of the fynbos and restores biodiversity as well as the water yields. But we also know that conventional clearing in the same catchment, for every 1 hectare of conventional clearing today, we would save 50 times that value in 2 fire events or 40 years. So while the cost of conventional clearing increases exponentially, the cost of invasive management with fire doesn't increase exponentially, giving us a really good opportunity to utilize it. Next slide, please. So what does successful fire management require? It really isn't as simple as just lighting. We need careful preparation and planning. Next slide, please, Flo. We need enabling conditions. Next one, too. We need clear frameworks and permits. And our South African legislation doesn't adequately cater for the conditions needed for successful invasive management fires. Required burning on high-risk days to achieve desired outcomes is something that is not encouraged within our current legislation. We need competent implementing agencies, skilled crews, landowner cooperation, and the legal implications of that are a lot more difficult than we think. And we need meteorological luck, which is difficult to do within the funding cycles that are given to us as NPCs. But most of all, we need opportunism and flexibility. And what do I mean by opportunism? We wouldn't have tried to do the Jobatina Dam if those 2 previous fires hadn't occurred. On the slide, you can see the small hatched red in the middle is the Jobatina fire, and the west and eastern fires are the occurring wildfires. To burn on a day with a high fire index in South Africa is very difficult to pull off without serious planning and buy-in. It's essential for the successful control, though, of the pine trees. If we had failed to achieve the desired outcome of killing these pine trees, we would have seriously affected the perceptions of fire as a tool for invasive management, which is why we sat waiting for 2 years for the perfect conditions in order to actually achieve this fire. But it also means that we can plan the next prescribed burn. There's nothing better for risk mitigation and safe burning than to burn into existing burn areas. In just the last wildfire in this area, which is the large brown cross-hatched one on the far western side of the map, estimates indicate that achieving the same invasive vegetation control measures would have cost 60 to 80 million rand. But fire management for this fire in the last month only cost 4.5 million rand. That's clearly a win, and certainly a win at scale when we're talking about 20,000+ hectares. My team spent over 650 hours with wildfire suppression just in the last 3 months, with over 30,000 hectares or 60,000 acres that's burnt. And that's just 6 of us. And we're not firefighters by any stretch of the imagination. But it gives us the ability and opportunity to build real trust which in turn allows for opportunities for future proactive fire management. You can go to the next one. So the next map overlays the history of fire within the 6 most important catchments of the Landkloof. And you can clearly see the correlations there. But while catchments might have clearly defined watersheds, fires and therefore fire management cannot. They don't stop on watersheds. They don't stop on boundaries. So we need a different perspective to have integrated fire management within our catchment management approaches. And these are not only essential for the Landkloof and the agricultural sector within the Landkloof, but also for the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, which is a major city downstream of us. So we have now an opportunity to start an integrated fire management system safely that's in the interests of all the affected parties, from forestry to national and provincial parks, and all the landowners and local communities dependent on only a few water sources within the Landkloof. And this is able to address more consistent water in the face of serious climate concerns, a reality never more apparent than in the current drought that we are in. But to do that, we need to overcome fear and perceptions around fire. The common fears are that it's too risky, too expensive, and too complex. But the risks to the landscape are incredibly, incredibly high, and managed fire reduces those risks. We need positive fire stories to build trust and confidence, and the psychological value of seeing safe and effective burns is incredibly, incredibly important. Next slide, please. So we need collective action. We need to work together to mitigate the negative impact of large wildfires, and we need collective buy-in to strategically use fire in all of the areas that we work, and I would argue in many areas that are dependent on fire globally. Cross-catchment, cross-watershed, and cross-boundary integrated fire management practices need to be implemented. Second to last slide, please, Flo. So I would argue that we need to move towards a culture of fire, which is our vision for the Cape Floristic region. We need a landscape governed by proactive fire regimes, not crisis response, where fire is embedded into the long-term ecological restoration plans, and communities who understand and support fire as a tool. If we are to achieve a future where Fynbos is healthier, safer, and more climate resilient, ever more apparent in droughts, like I said, like this. Next slide, please. So for me, this is a bit of a call to action. If you're a scientist, research fire ecology, share knowledge and accessibility that is local and dependent on your situations. If you're in government, understand the regulations and fund coordination. But also, if you're a citizen, understand that not all smoke is bad smoke. We need to utilize it in a safe and responsible way. So my closing remarks are that we need to reignite resilience. You can put it on the last page, please, Flo. Fire is not the enemy here. Fire is a part of the natural rhythm of this land. And to future-proof our catchments, we really need to learn how to burn well and to share our experiences and these small wins to encourage it in other areas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. Truly an insightful presentation. We'll move to the next presentation from Leo Grade team. We have Jason and Will with us, who will be speaking to us about the efforts they have been taking in the Rio Grande waterfront from a collaborative perspective. So Jason is the forestry director for the TNC New Mexico. He has a PhD in environmental and forest sciences from the University of Washington and more than a decade of experience supporting conservation and restoration of forest in several countries, including United States, Peru, Uganda, Congo, among others. Will, on the other hand, works as a prescribed fire specialist, where he focuses in managing the All Ads fire network to increase the use of wood fire across New Mexico's dry forest. So welcome, Jason and Will.
Thank you for the introduction, Florence. It's great to be here with all of you today. Greetings from chilly Santa Fe, New Mexico. So Will and I today, as Florence mentioned, are going to introduce you to our All Hands, All Lands collaborative bird network. And to set that in context, we want to start with, I'm going to introduce, if you're not already familiar, what's happening in the American Southwest and the challenges facing forests in the Southwest. The response of TNC New Mexico is principally through what we call the Rio Grande Water Fund, which is a water fund funded by water users to protect water resources, principally from catastrophic wildfire. So what we're going to do over the next 15 minutes is really introduce the architecture of the different programs and activities that get fire on the ground in order to protect our water resources in New Mexico and beyond. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Jason, sharing the screen now.
No problem. You can go to the next one beyond that one. Excellent, thank you. All right, so to set the context, when folks think about the American Southwest, they often begin by thinking about deserts or really hot environments. And certainly that's true. We have a lot of desert. It certainly can be really hot here. But we also have tens of millions of acres of forests. We have dry forests all the way to wet forest at our highest elevations. Like forests around the world, the forests of the American Southwest are facing a variety of threats, including climate change. So to set the context for the work that we're doing in New Mexico, I want to share with you really the dual challenges that climate change is presenting to us, and really the approach that we're taking in response. And first and foremost, I want to just introduce the concept of the fire deficit. So the figure that you see on the screen is showing you the forest history essentially over time in the American Southwest. So from 1600 up through 2100. And what you'll notice is around 1850, late 1800s, things shift. And what happens is fire is excluded. So this is railroads arrive in the American Southwest. Indigenous people are continue to be pushed onto reservations. Cultural fire is excluded. Livestock grazing is massively expanded. And that confluence of factors essentially puts fire out on the landscape. And similar to the fynbos in South Africa, the forest of the American Southwest are fire adapted, that they have evolved with fire. And what happened with that fire exclusion is essentially the forest got incredibly dense. And without that fire, what happened is they became a tinderbox. So when fire did come, it wasn't the low intensity burns of the past where fire would create mosaic park-like conditions. No, no longer. It's massive wildfires where all the wood is destroyed, where all the resources are destroyed, or at least significant amounts compared to the past. So this is the fire deficit component that we're facing, is that we don't have enough fire on the landscape to keep the ecosystem, the dry forest ecosystem, healthy and resilient to wildfire. Next click, please. So on the other hand, interestingly, and perhaps ironically, we face a challenge of not only not enough fire, our fire deficit, but on the other hand, with the increasing effects of climate change, we face a challenge of what's called too much fire. And what that is as our region is beginning to get drier and drier with climate change, the temperatures are going up. And when fires do happen, they are much bigger and they are much more intense in terms of their destruction. An example of that is what you see on the screen here, the Las Conchas fire. So at the time, in 2011, this was New Mexico's largest wildfire in its history. It burned 150,000 acres. It was the catalyst for the Rio Grande Water Fund. Essentially, it woke up the region to widespread recognition across all sectors of society that something needed to be done. Something had to be done to make our forests more resilient. We needed to restore them so that when fire did come, they didn't explode with catastrophic wildfire. Well, since 2011, we've actually had 4 more large wildfires, even bigger than Las Conchas, which really underlines the importance of our work. So that's the context, is that Our forests are, to some degree, overstocked and ready to explode with fire. And on the other hand, we don't have enough fire to ensure that the forests continue to evolve and be healthy and resilient like it was in the past with low intensity burns versus these high intensity catastrophic fires. Next slide, please. All right, so a little bit more context before we jump into the details of our response in terms of our fire program, and Will's really going to dive into that in just a few minutes. But I wanted to just mention how the Rio Grande Water Fund works and to show you a map of where we work. So on the right side of the screen, that is the Rio Grande Water Fund footprint. It's about 7 million acres of land. About 2 million acres of it is forests that need restoration, that essentially fire has been excluded for 150 plus years in most places, and we need to get fire back into the landscape. To do so, we typically need to thin out the forest as an initial first entry, and then we can bring low intensity fire back through prescribed fire. So how does the Rio Grande Water Fund help make that happen? Our theory of change, like all theories of change, is based on the idea that if we do something, then we expect a certain outcome because of an assumption that we have. So in this case, you can see the flow of our theory of change. Essentially, we collect money from water users, governments, and donors that essentially go towards restoration in this broader landscape. Again, that's thinning and that's burning. And through that, ultimately, because thinning and burning restore the integrity of the forest and allow that low intensity fire to come back at a periodic interval of 20 to 30 years, essentially, we are allowing forests to come back to what it once was in shaping the forest and the plants and animals that depend on it. So that's the Rio Grande Water Fund, to say that the implementation of our prescribed fire activities are through our All Hands All Lands network, which was catalyzed by the Rio Grande Water Fund. Today, the All Hands All Lands is a program within our Forest and Fire program, just like Rio Grande Water Fund, but really the Rio Grande Water Fund catalyzed in terms of money, in terms of resource, and other things, catalyzed the All Hands All Lands network. Next slide, please. All right, so the All Hands All Lands network is part of our Good Fire strategy. So again, we have Rio Grande Water Fund on one hand, that's obtaining the money, supporting the thinning, and we have our Good Fire program on the other side. And that includes the implementation is through All Hands All Lands. So there's really 4 kind of pillars of our Good Fire strategy. And I want to walk you through what they are. On the next slide, I'm going to tell you about the policy pieces, and then I'm going to pass it to Will to talk about the ins and outs of actually getting the good work done on the ground. So policy, please, if you wouldn't mind going back. Thank you. So just real quick, policy is about ensuring proper enabling conditions. So in the state of New Mexico, there's a lot of activity around improving fire management, and I'm going to talk with you about that in just a moment on the next slide. Planning, of course, is just what it is. It's about planning, but it's really leveraging the expertise of a wide variety of individuals and organizations that know how to get fire onto the ground safely. And Will's going to really speak to that in full because he's one of our experts. Implementation is about workforce. So these burns take a lot of people, some large, 5, 10,000 acre burns. We're having 30, 40 plus firefighters on the scene. So these are not small endeavors. It takes a lot of coordination, a lot of planning, as you'll hear about in just a moment. And then finally, training. In order to have that workforce ready and in order to scale our work on the ground, we invest a lot of time and energy in training the next generation of firefighters, as well as training the current generation in order to up their skills so that we can continue to expand the types and the extent of the work that's happening on the ground. Next slide, please. All right, so as mentioned, policy is about ensuring the enabling conditions are available for fire professionals to get their work done on the ground. And just to say, this can be folks that work for the state, folks that work for the Nature Conservancy or other nonprofits, but also in our region, there are large land holdings. So private landowners are also needing those enabling conditions to be successful. I have here on this slide just a few highlights that we've been a part of over the last decade and moving forward in the policy space. So Forest and Watershed Restoration Act is similar to the Rio Grande Water Fund. It's about getting funds to actually do the work on the ground, but these funds are coming from the state rather than specifically water users. Next up, Prescribed Burning Act. This supporting legislation essentially creates the ability of private landowners to get fire on the ground and to do so knowing that they are protected if they follow the rules, if they get the right permits, they go through a training program, and thus their liabilities, if there happens to be escape, are much lower. So they are supported in getting fire back onto their private lands. And then finally, New Mexico has a long history of firefighting. A lot of the pueblos in this region have been massively supportive for 50 plus years in getting crews on the ground to fight fire, and now today to introduce prescribed fire. So we now have 2 wildland crews that are active 24/7, ready to go. One more click, please, and then I'll pass it to Will. Okay, so some other policy enabling conditions that we're working on that are necessary for that holistic approach, like we're aiming towards with our Good Fire strategy, is many Western states have a damage fund for prescribed fire. So if there is an escape, there's funds available to pay for any damages. New Mexico does not have a damage fund, so that's something that we're working towards. Next up, other states like California also have recognition of cultural burning. Indigenous communities have a right to burn, again, if they follow certain training protocols and operate within what the legislation says, they can do what they've been doing for thousands of years. That is not currently codified in law in New Mexico. And then finally, to scale our work, as I mentioned earlier, through training, through increasing the credentials of the workforce, we need additional investments in our workforce in New Mexico. So that's the future horizon for policy and enabling conditions. Next slide, and we'll pass it on to Will.
Great, thanks for teeing me up there, Jason. Like you mentioned, Will Joy. I'm the prescribed fire specialist for the Nature Conservancy here in New Mexico. Here to talk about our All Hands, All Lands burn network. As Jason mentioned, we recognize this deficit, and as far as implementing and getting that work done on the ground, we recognize the gap that the workforce and everything, all the enabling conditions to get those folks to get the acres done was missing. So the All Hands, All Lands network was put together. As you can see here, we're building towards a place where fire is used when and where appropriate for community ecosystem resilience without those insurmountable barriers. So here we've got kind of the management of it. We've got the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Stewards Guild. We both have our own respective resources that we can bring there. TNC has a larger fire network at a nation level that we can call into. We also have a local module. The Forest Stewards Guild holds some employees. FSYC is their youth corps. And the call when CWN is call when needed staff. So the idea was to have a nimble workforce that's available to assist and do different work at different times. This management piece comes together for the funding through Rio Grande Water Fund. We also need to develop a large network of agreements to make this work really viable. Can I get a click? One more. So then we've got this large network of partners. First, we have our tribal partners, just some examples of our Pueblo partners there. We've got MOUs and working agreements with them to make those partnerships work. We also work with governmental agencies. So the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, Park Service, and then these bottom two are state agencies, so the State Land Office and MNERD is our Division of Forestry. Another clip. And to complete kind of this all hands, all lands circle is the private portion of it. We work with private landowners, we work with universities, other NGOs, and then these bottom two are some additional youth corps that we work with, Rocky Mountain Youth Corps and Ancestral Land Corps. So that's just kind of the big picture of who we work with and and how we get things done. And like I said, the management port or the agreement portion of that is really important to have that base in place to get work done across these lands. As Jason mentioned, the first thing that we'll have to do is planning. And again, you see TNC and Forest Stewards Guild um, at the top here. And what we're doing is we're identifying, we're scoping, we're seeing where these priority landscapes are, and we're sharing our funding and our knowledge. Can I get one more click? So in this process, um, through all these different agreements and partners that we work with, we have different planning processes for different landscapes. So that first you see is tribal lands planning. We've got one example there of an Upper Largo. That's with our Santa Clara Pueblo. And what we're doing there is we identified a need, and where all hands, all lands comes in there is being able to lean on those relationships we have with federal partners and bringing the necessary folks to the table to get that conversation started and get the things implemented and be useful for our tribal partners. We've got state lands planning next. We've got a Black Lake RX that we've been continually doing. It's a landscape in northern New Mexico. That one's a really fun partnership. It's with the state land office, who does not have their own fire capacity. So they're planning, they're implementing some timber operations, but they don't have the capacity to do any burning. So through that, we can bring together the appropriate folks. We can get burn plans in place. We can do the smoke permitting. We can do all those things and then actually get folks on the ground. One more click. Private lands planning. So we've got two different kind of things that we look at here. TNC lands in the state of New Mexico are considered private lands. And then we also have private landowners outside of the Nature Conservancy. What makes this partnership and all hands, all lands really powerful is that we've got different organizations that have different qualification specs and different capacities that can work on different lands, where the Nature Conservancy needs to jump through NWCG qualifications. The Forest Stewards Guild doesn't necessarily have to, and they can implement on private lands. One more click. And then this last one is this federal and private lands collaborations. Here in the U.S., we've got a congressionally designated act, the Wyden Authority, and that gives the federal government the appropriate avenues to do work on private lands adjacent to federal lands. So what we do there is we have the capability and the capacity to work with private landowners who are adjacent to forests, and we are able to make those connections and bring those agreements together. Next slide. As far as once we have these things planned and how we implement, and this is filling that workforce gap that all hands, all lands was initially was started for. So you can see up top, we've got different kinds of projects there. We've got federal, private, and state. And the next few clicks will show how we put our resources into play. So can I get one click? Our federal partners, they usually tend to burn large landscapes, a lot of acres, and don't necessarily have the folks to be able to pull off large acres and large burns. So you can see through our agreements, we can send our resources, our firefighters from tribal, TNC folks, and the Forest Stewards Guild. We all have those agreements where we can flow in and support large acres on federal lands. Another click, we move on to our private lands. So here, this kind of illustrates our TNC lands where we're following certain federal guidelines where TNC New Mexico. We've identified these, and then we will send folks from TNC New Mexico, and the guild will come support us on our burns. One more. Like I said earlier, a lot of private lands, privately owned by individuals. The Forest Stewards Guild, that's really their niche, and that's what makes these partnerships great, is we can help with planning, and then when implementation comes, the Forest Stewards Guild can go and implement that and get those acres burned. And one more. And our state land with our state, like I mentioned, with partners that don't have their own resources. These burns in particular are really fun. If people across the country or even the globe are familiar with the TREX, the Prescribed Fire Training Exchanges, this is our attempt at making collaborative burns where we have folks from all of our agreements, all different colored trucks and hard hats coming together for a collaborative burn, and it's a really good example of how to get acres done that regularly wouldn't be implemented without these agreements and collaborations. Next slide. And then, as Jason had mentioned, our last one, we realized that we need to get this work done, but we know that we can't do it without training the next generation of firefighters and also getting those higher qualifications and the experience needed to get acres burned into the future. So with the Forest Stewards Guild, the Nature Conservancy, we collaborate together to put on everything from basic trainings on through advanced, and then giving live fire experience when we are out on burns. One click. The first thing we do is our youth corps. We recognize that they're going to be the ones to take over for us in the future. So all those youth corps, Rocky Mountain Youth Corps, Ancestral Land Corps, and Forest Stewards Guild Youth Corps, those are the folks that we're putting on a basic firefighter training for, 130, 190, and then chainsaw training. Next click. And then our next thing that we're really excited about is catering and designing courses to meet the tribal needs in the Southwest environment. So we're developing some more advanced courses with local needs in mind. We're partnering with our tribal partners right now to put on some fire effects courses with cultural and environmental needs of the Southwest in mind. And the last one. And Jason had mentioned, we have gotten through our Prescribed Fire Act, the state certified burn program. And as Jason mentioned, that is to implement burns on private lands with private landowners. And we are working with the state and other folks to develop that further and make it useful and manageable for those folks.
Great. Thank you, Will. So I'm going to wrap up quickly. A few highlights from our talk today. Just really want to emphasize that the American Southwest, as you know, is on the front line in the changing climate. We're facing a number of different challenges as a result. Fire impacts our water supplies in many different ways, from large debris flows after fire events that pollute the water, dam up equipment, so on and so forth. So we're really facing a whole host of challenges, but our forests are also part of the solution. We really see in New Mexico that we're helping create a template, just like our colleagues in other parts of the world, like South Africa, to respond to climate change. As it continues to increase in severity, more and more folks are going to need to adopt the strategies that we're adopting here in New Mexico. So I hope that you were able to learn a little bit today about how one might approach these sorts of challenges holistically. We do that in New Mexico through Rio Grande Water Fund and All Hands, All Lands. And ultimately, this is a holistic approach that is collaborative in nature, through and through, as you can see. And we'd welcome any questions that folks might have, and would be more than happy to talk with folks offline if that would be helpful. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jason. and Will for that great presentation, a lot of learnings. So just to move things along, because of time, we have Morrison, who will be talking to us about conservation finance as well as corrective action. He is a senior manager of international programs at Blue Forest, a non-profit conservation finance organization that developed the Forest Reliance Board to accelerate forest restoration for wildfire risk reduction and watershed health. Welcome, Morrison. You can share your own screen. Great, I see it.
Great. You see the screen and you got me on audio? Thank you so
Yes.
much. Amazing. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Morrison Mast. I'm the head of international programs at Blue Forest. Super important topic today, and I love forums like this. Very valuable to share learnings, experiences, and explore different models and approaches that can help address these problems at scale. You'll have to excuse me for the occasional sneeze here. I have a darling 1-year-old at home that loves to bring home illnesses. Morrison Mast here, background in biology and environmental policy. I've been working in the biodiversity conservation space since I was old enough to volunteer on projects as a student. Started as a sea turtle researcher, living in Brazil and Panama and Colombia, and then increasingly found myself more drawn to understanding new business models that could attract more private capital to support and scale conservation outcomes. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. Super excited to hear and see a large international audience here. My current role at Blue Forest is focusing on developing conservation finance solutions to expand the pool of capital available to scale up conservation and restoration work with a focus on adapting Blue Forest's models in international contexts. So today we'll have a bit of an introduction to Blue Forest and how we work and our view and definition of conservation finance. We'll provide some context on the wildfire crisis in the Western US, which I'll try to make less duplicative with Jason and Will's fantastic introduction, since we're already kind of grounded in that geography. Thank you. And then I'll talk about the Forest Resilience Bond, our flagship conservation finance product, which we've deployed across the Western US. We'll talk about some of the mechanics of the vehicle, the range of supported ecosystem services, and we'll close with a spotlight on our pilot program in California and our pipeline. So first, a little bit about Blue Forest. We're a nonprofit organization based in California focused on conservation finance. We bring people, finance, and science together to restore and protect forests, watersheds, ecosystems, and communities. We have 3 pillars to our approach, which are reflected in the 3 major programmatic teams we have at Blue Forest. So first, all of our work is based on the best available science, both Western and Indigenous science, to develop conservation finance products that are delivering measurable outcomes on the landscape. Next, we have a dedicated finance team with expertise in everything from private equity and debt to more traditional conservation funding models. That team raises and manages the assets we deploy for restoration and conservation and provides the financial structuring, leadership, and support for our partners. And the third pillar is collaboration. And to that end, we have a project development team with a broad range of expertise on natural resource management, stakeholder engagement, which is really the heart and I think the hardest part of enacting meaningful change on the landscape. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So I want to start us off with some definitions to get us all on the same page. We at Blue Forest define conservation finance as the process of raising new funding and financing capital to support conservation and restoration goals. And I start here because I want to clearly delineate what we see as 2 very separate but interconnected concepts, those of funding and financing. When I talk about funding, we're talking about money that's not meant to be repaid by the recipient or implementer back to that funding source. Think of your typical philanthropic or government grant that is awarded to an organization or contractor to achieve a specific service or outcome. And when I talk about financing capital, we're talking about money lent out by investors or lenders to another party who's expected to pay it back with interest. Think about like a car loan or a mortgage. These concepts are invented pieces of financial infrastructure in our society that allow us to reap the benefits of something today without paying for it all up front. Financing requires underlying funding sources or cash flows to repay that principal and interest. And it's how we as a society can do things like pay for a bridge or a water treatment plant, or in our case, forest restoration. the goals of conservation finance, as we see them, are first to support larger scale visions and projects that can start to approach the types of landscape scale change that can really move the needle on environmental and societal problems. And we've seen in all the cases today, it's really hard to accomplish something on a pilot scale. It's even harder to accomplish something on a landscape scale. And you'll see as we kind of go through these case studies, Blue Forest is really founded on this pilot to scale approach. How do we prove something out here that can be scaled up, both in terms of the programmatic work, but also in terms of the financing and capital available to achieve it? Another goal is to accelerate project implementation by raising the capital up front that is needed to achieve the work at that envisioned scale. Another goal is to bring best practices to larger landscapes that reflect the values of a larger group of stakeholders that are aligned on that vision. And as Jason and Will mentioned, that we want to build lasting structures with every project that we do that support capacity building for our partners, so we can really set the foundation for long-term stewardship and management of landscapes. So before we jump into some of the mechanics of how we deploy conservation finance approaches, let's ground ourselves in a little bit of geography and ecology in the American West. The two photos you see here are taken from the same exact vantage point in the California Sierras, nearly 100 years apart. And just looking at the forest, you can see that prior to the extensive logging that took place in the first part of the 20th century, as Jason was kind of telling us, we have a forest with diverse age classes of trees, from hundreds of year-old giants to saplings spaced out on the landscape. This type of forest structure experienced fire at regular intervals, both natural and indigenous sparked fires that removed undergrowth, prevented major pest outbreaks, and was generally a more stable forest structure from a watershed health perspective. Because of this removal of native managers from the land and decades of fire suppression policies, what we see 100 years later is a forest structure that is packed full of fuel, relatively young trees growing close together. And when fires break out, they jump into the crowns of trees, they burn harder, faster across larger areas, and leave the watershed in a degraded, erosive state. Lots of crossover here with what you're seeing in South Africa and the Southwest. There are things that can be done, as everyone has kind of talked about today. And by investing in these things like controlled burning and thinning, we can prevent these mega fires from breaking out. The photo above did the rounds a few years back, and I love it. I always continue to include it because it's such a stark demonstration of the effect that the treatments can have on maintaining a fire resilient forest. So while we know treatment can be effective, it is also very costly, and the scale of the problem is enormous. This is a map of wildfire risk across the Western US with higher risk in the hotter colors here. There are approximately 60 million acres at moderate to high wildfire risk in the US, putting over 4 million homes at high to extreme risk. The costs of wildfire are not only borne by homeowners and insurance premium payers. The annual health costs have been estimated to be anywhere from $75 to $130 billion in the Western US alone. There's a study last year that came out that estimated that something like 80,000 early deaths could be attributed to the wildfire smoke just from the 2023 Canadian fires, many of those deaths occurring outside of Canada in the US and Europe. So this is really a whole of society issue that crosses international borders. And here's where water comes into the picture. The US National Forest System, who's our main partner in the US, those lands are the source of watersheds for drinking water for nearly 60 million people. There's a single water utility in Northern California that is responsible for providing water to 1 out of every 12 Americans. And this water is sourced primarily from Forest Service and other federally managed public lands that are extremely high risk of catastrophic wildfire affecting their watershed function. Cleaner and more reliable water sources are one of the many benefits of wildfire risk reduction work. And Blue Forest takes what we call a multi-benefits approach to conservation finance, where we holistically and scientifically assess the potential benefits of forest restoration and try to engage a broader pool of beneficiaries that can pay for the outcomes of forest restoration. And to be direct here, there's simply not enough money in the system from traditional sources right now to do the work needed at the scale that's needed. The Forest Resilience Bond was really designed with this in mind. How do we create a structure that allows for other parties to contribute to the work when it clearly benefits them? And before we talk about how the rubber hits the road with this concept, I want to highlight that while we're focused on wildfire and water today, my job is to think about how we can apply a multi-benefits approach in conjunction with this infrastructure finance lens to achieve all the goals of conservation in other settings, from addressing flood risk to drought risk to biodiversity loss. These same tools and mechanisms can be brought to bear on a much wider range of problems. Okay, so the Forest Resilience Bond was first launched by Blue Forest back in 2018. And while it's a relatively simple structure, it stands on the shoulders of some of the great work done by the U.S. Forest Service, organizations like the Nature Conservancy and Stanford's Natural Capital Project that have done a lot of thinking around financing against payments for ecosystem services. And at its core, the FRB is a cost-sharing mechanism that allows for private investor capital to earn a return on investment by financing the upfront costs of restoration. Borrowed funds are repaid by a bundle of contracted cash flows that are set up by Blue Forest and its partners ahead of time. The way it works in this simplified diagram is that investors put money into the Forest Resilience Bond for a set amount of time. The FRB here is a business entity all on its own that exists for the duration of the project. The FRB then makes these funds available to implementation partners. These are the organizations or contractors responsible for completing the work. And that money is made available to them at a 0% or low as a 0% or low interest loan. The restoration activities are completed and the implementation partners pay back the FRB. And additionally, Blue Forest models the multiple benefits that result from the restoration work and develops contractual agreements with beneficiaries that also pay the Forest Resilience Bond back as the work is completed. When the project is done, investors receive their money back with interest resulting from the additional beneficiary payments. One thing to note here is that this is structured as a revolving line of credit for implementation partners, where partners can draw up to a predetermined limit, kind of like a credit card. And once that money is repaid, it's recycled or revolved back into the implementation work many times over the lifetime of the FRB. It's a simple structure, but one that requires a lot of coordination between multiple government agencies, Native nations, private corporations, and community-based organizations. And that's a lot of the project development work that Blue Forest does. So let's talk about some of the roles and responsibilities here of the partners that engage in an FRB. You have a land manager, in many cases, the U.S. Forest Service, that approves the work and is often the main source of anchor funding. In addition to public agencies, we also work with private landowners and Native nations. You also have an implementation partner that this is the group that either does the work or contracts it out and submits invoices to the Forest Resilience Bond. And you have utilities and other corporations that share in the cost of that work and collaborate with Blue Forest on benefit evaluation as needed. And then you have an intermediary project developer. This is the role that in the US Blue Forest plays, which develops the structure around financing and benefits agreements. We conduct due diligence on project implementers, funding sources, we manage investor relationships, reporting, and overall capital management for the structure. The part of setting up the structure that I would say varies the most from project to project is engagement of paying beneficiaries. Some, as we'll see in a moment with the example, are interested in things like water yield, debris removal, while others may be more motivated by recreational opportunities or biodiversity uplift. And this is why a lot of Blue Forest upfront work is in ecological benefit modeling by our science team. That modeling process is conducted iteratively and hand in hand with potential beneficiaries, starting from identifying the areas where land manager priorities and those of beneficiaries overlap. We then work closely with the staff of that beneficiary to translate modeled ecological benefits into value that beneficiaries can expect to see as a result of the project. Depending on the beneficiary, this can be put in financial terms, risk reduction terms, or other values that meet some kind of corporate or environmental social responsibility goal. So I'm going to close with a brief profile of our pilot project in 2018 and our current project portfolio, which is on the next slide. And I think one of the things that has been part of the backbone and DNA of how Blue Forest operates is thinking about things in a pilot to scale mentality. We work with a lot of investors for whom working to finance a $4 million project is relatively a small project for them to finance. And it involves working with all of these partners, many more in some of these projects, and a lot of time from an organization like Blue Forest and for an investor to help due diligence and do all the contracting around. And that cost on an initial pilot project can quickly scale up to kind of make it look not worth it on a project to project basis. But where we've seen success is being able to paint a picture of how an initial project can scale up to a larger area. It really helps in that case to have aligned agencies and project plans and a pipeline that shows that an initial project can lead up to larger project finance opportunities. So this is what we're looking at here is the northern part of the Tahoe National Forest in the Sierra Nevada in California. This is the North Yuba River watershed here. Lake Tahoe is kind of down at the bottom here. And the main beneficiary that we worked with in this case, the project implementer here is the National Forest Foundation, which is carrying out and contracting a lot of the work. The landowner here is the U.S. Forest Service that has a wildfire risk mitigation plan and a certain allotment of money to get that done. And the beneficiary that we're working with in this case is the Yuba Water Agency, then called the Yuba Water Agency, now Yuba Water, that maintains a dam and a reservoir at the very bottom of this watershed and sells both hydroelectricity and water itself down to downstream users. And some of the costs that they face and potential impacts of wildfire are a lot of woody debris entering their watershed. And when we talk about what the benefits to a beneficiary like this are, one of the main things that is of interest to them, we talk about both about revenue enhancing activities. If we can do forest restoration on an area that is shown to meaningfully increase the amount of water flowing into the reservoir, they can tie that to a top line revenue figure in terms of how much water they can sell downstream. But also if we can talk about avoided costs in terms of removing woody debris from these waterways, that's an avoided cost for this water agency that can be brought into a balance sheet. And so along those lines is how we make that case for a beneficiary like Yuba Water to engage in a project. I'll close here by saying there's far too many people to kind of recognize this is one project that we've done where we've scaled up from 15,000 acres to 50,000 acres treated. And in each of these, you have a kind of a similar assortment of partners, some the same, some different, but we've been able to take this model on a project by project basis and raise a larger fund called the Forest Resilience Bond Catalyst Facility that allows us to deploy money across similarly shaped projects across the U.S. West. So we have, as you can see, a number of projects across California that operate in the same kind of structure, have expanded into Oregon and Washington in the past 3 or 4 years. And looking forward, we're looking at expanding into Colorado and also applying some of the lessons learned here into different contexts internationally, where you also have high wildfire risk, things like flood risks that also can benefit from an approach like this. So really excited to kind of take any questions about this model, but how it might apply in your geographies. And thanks again for having me on this panel to speak with the rest of you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Morrison, for the great presentation. I see questions coming in the chat and both chat and the Q&A. Please keep them coming as our speakers continue to answer them. So our last presentation for today will be from Kirsten Watson, who currently manages the Greater Cape Town Water Fund, leading catchment restoration efforts to improve water security for the Greater Cape region with a goal of replenishing 55 billion liters back to nature. Welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you, Florence. I just want to check if you can see my screen on presentation mode.
It's loading, but we can see it.
Okay, so I can go ahead.
Yes.
Great. Thanks. So I'm the manager for the Greater Cape Town Water Fund, and I'm going to explain a little bit about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and some challenges we've faced, and the solutions we've had to come up with in quite a challenging environment in terms of where we're working. So specifically, how can we use fire as an opportunistic tool, but also with intentionality to make our work more efficient and cost effective? So
Sorry, Justin,
yes.
it's still loading to come to presentation mode. Maybe you can drop and maybe
Okay.
share it again.
Um,
Perfect.
can you see it now? Okay, great.
Yes. Yes, it looks great. Please proceed.
Okay, sorry, it was just not clicking. Okay, so in South Africa, as you've seen by Matthew's presentation, we have quite a problem with alien invasive plants, and that's largely due to unmanaged watersheds. And we're losing significant amount of water across the country. And there's a few stats there, but there's also the economic cost. In a country that is water scarce with extreme water disparity between areas that have a lot of water. So 10% of our land mass holds 50% of where water comes from in terms of surface water runoff. And this was really evident in the news headlines with the City of Cape Town Day Zero. So that was the number of days before the City of Cape Town ran out of water in 2017, 2018. And we are prone to droughts. And this is going to be an ongoing problem. And we can't afford to be losing this much water due to alien invasive plants invading our watersheds. We need to do something about it. There's a real sense of urgency. So the Greater Cape Town Water Fund was established in 2018 to look at priority catchments that hold the most amount of surface water that fill the majority of dams that supply the city of Cape Town with water and the greater region. And through the business case, we aim to clear 54,300 hectares to replenish 55 billion liters back into the catchments through stream flow. And this work has been ongoing. It's been quite successful. We have shown great progress in the catchments. So we've improved management of over 41,000 hectares, which is about over 100,000 acres. You can see teams go up into the mountain catchments where it's invaded with pine trees. They use rope access tools to access these inaccessible areas. And we have good tracking systems in place to monitor our stream flow. So of the 55 billion liters, we're already returning 35 billion liters back into the catchment and having significant co-benefits through employment. So it all sounds great, right? No problems. So we got to a point where we've done the easier to access work, so even with the rope work, and what's left, the last about 30% of the work that's left is really challenging. It is super inaccessible. It is very time consuming, high density of alien invasive plants, mostly with mixed stands. So there's mature adult plants, young adult plants, and sometimes seedlings as well in the areas on very steep slopes. And it's costing a lot of money. So we had to put our minds together to think what else could we use to be more cost efficient with our watershed management. And one option was looking at fire. Firstly, fire as an opportunistic approach for where we can use fire to our advantage when there are wildfires. And secondly, prescribed fires at catchment scale so that we can start making real progress in those areas that are so inaccessible. So what we aim to do is to optimize our approach to catchment restoration in areas that we can't access. We wanted to demonstrate that we could do this at a scale that's at catchments or watersheds. And we wanted to collect evidence to further motivate the use of integrated control mechanisms, so both manual clearing and the use of fire. Because Earlier, Matthew was mentioning the difficulty of getting this through legislative processes and having buy-in from the right government entities, and you need evidence to do that in future. So we attempted to do this. So we started with a catchment area that we identified called the Mundles subcatchment, and we started planning a prescribed burn. This catchment has an average invasion density of 50%. It's 2,500 hectares. And we initially estimated that if we had to clear it manually, it would cost over 10 million rand. But if we used fire as a tool, it would be around 2 million rand was our estimates. And it was a great test study for where we'd like to apply fire in future. We also did ecological analysis to see if it was ready for burning and consulted various experts on that, and it was ready for burning. So this is just what it looks like. So you'll see there's an old fire on the left side of the catchment. So it partly burned some of the mature pines there. And on the right side of the catchment is completely invaded with a mix of mature pines and young pines. And we wanted to light that in terms of large-scale fire. We spent a lot of time in planning this, 1.5 years of planning. So we first had to pull a proposal together for the authorities to approve this work. This is not TNC land. This is land owned by Cape Nature. We had to establish a multi-partner fire working group with the various authorities and people that needed to be on board. So the logos are here. So it was quite a big group of experts, expert panel. We had to have various plans in place, so a monitoring and evaluation framework, a communication plan, as well as a burn plan. We also did pre-burn preparation in that time period. So landowner permission and insurance, that takes time to approve. Implementation of the communication plan, you have to make the local stakeholders aware of what we're intending to do. Implementation of the fire breaks to make it a safe burn area, and also collecting the pre-burn baseline data to monitor the impact, which included the alien invasion density, terrestrial monitoring plots for recovery, freshwater aquatic biodiversity and the quality of the water, as well as a bird survey to see if they couldn't be indicators for long-term monitoring of catchment restoration as one of the tools we could use to monitor over time. Then we had the fire, which was great. So it's nicely burnt. In the foreground, you can see the skeletons of the young pine. So these are saplings. Some of them have a few pine cones, but we achieved quite a lot what we wanted to achieve before these young pines start coning. That's when you want the fire to come through so that you can kill that generation of seed set. And then you only have seed that's in the swill left to deal with that germinate. But this fire was not our prescribed burn. This was actually a wildfire. So we were quite fortunate in that we used this wildfire and all our planning for the prescribed burn to actually burn the area that we wanted to burn in the planning. So again, using opportunity. So having the years of planning put in place, having the fire chief on board with what we wanted to do allowed those that make the decisions when a fire is happening to make decisions that are in favor of conservation goals and catchment restoration goals. So the fire came through and burnt over 4,000 hectares. That's about 10,000 acres. And we were very happy at this point. Then we realized that we actually need to determine the success. So we have our monitoring in place, but we didn't have a method to determine success because it burnt patchy. So some areas burnt clean, 100%, and other areas burnt in patches. So we needed to, at a catchment scale, see where do we need to put secondary resources to clear the areas that burnt patchy. And the best way that we found to do it was to use remote sensing to see where the burn area was, and then overlay various categories for fire severity in terms of extent of burn. And then we did a ground truthing exercise where we verified different types of categories with georeferenced photographs and then cross-reference that with a desktop assessment. And that seemed to work really well. So these are just the categories we used. We looked at the literature available on burn severity. We categorized them into these 5 categories. And here in the photographs, you can see how different the burn intensities are, where photograph A is what it looked like before, and then C, B, and D are the different types of burn severity. And then that allowed us to put in strategic management interventions. So we were able to prioritize where we wanted to do follow-up treatments where it did not burn 100%. And because it burnt a larger area, we had to prioritize where funding was spent and where resources went. And then we also looked at the option as a second burn in terms of the 0 to 50% category, where it was possible on a geographic scale. They rescheduled that follow-up within 6 months after the burn, and we're currently still busy with that. With our long-term monitoring, a lot of this is only just concluded and will continue into the future. So we're still looking at the freshwater biodiversity assessments that's ongoing. We've just completed the post-fire bird assessment. We've also completed the vegetation assessments post-fire. And we'll analyze the fire burnt areas versus the manual interventions that we've previously done in the catchments to look at cost effectivity, including the full time frame from planning to conclusion. And then lastly, a question we often get is what is the recovery of the natural vegetation? So we looked at our existing long-term vegetation monitoring plots and we measured the fire severity index. So that's, in a nutshell, you measure the smallest twig size and some other variables to see how hot it burnt and how much of the biomass was consumed. And that will be an indication of potentially the recovery of the natural vegetation over time. And we'll relate the severity to the recovery, and we'll continue that work. And in this, I'm very excited about the data management. So the Greater Cape Town Water Fund has an existing decision support system. It's an integrated approach with all our work across the catchment in the Water Fund. And we were able to update it with 4 new interventions. The one is where a prescribed fire burned 100%. A prescribed fire burns and you have to put in additional manual clearing, and then the same for the wildfire. And this allows us to then integrate the use of fire into our tracking tool, which we'll post on the chat and the resources as well. And then that integrates the use of the model we use for the water benefit as well and the hectare benefit of using fire. And this is my last slide where the future application. So we realized through this process that we need some clearer guidelines to actually look at fire as a tool for catchment restoration. So I feel that we have quite a lot of information between the partners and the landscape and also across South Africa, such as Living Lands, and looking at how can we use our existing pilots that we've done to pull together real guidelines to do this. So I think we've made some progress with the post-fire assessments, and there's a lot of literature already for the pre-fire planning. So I think there's a real need to have this in place. And this could be applicable across South Africa, where we're trying to initiate these alternative strategies. And then the more immediate future, we've had significant fires in our Greater Cape Town Water Fund footprint, and we'll be applying these same post-fire monitoring approaches to this new footprint and integrate it into our planning so that we can be conscious of how fire impacts our long-term restoration goals in the catchment. And that's it from me for now.
Great, thank you, Kirstine, and all the presenters, Morrison, Matt, Will, for the great presentation. So we don't have much time for the Q&A, but we might answer maybe 1 or 2 questions. So Matt, if you're able to come together with Jason and Will and Morrison as well to the main webinar. Matt, there was a question that was asked by Daniel, and you would like to answer that on air. This was on emphasis in restore rainforest to pre-infestation levels. I understand how these improve watershed health, but why is that inherently more resilient to a changing climate in your geographies? So any of you can answer, Jason, Bill, or Matthew.
Thanks. I'll just jump in quickly from the fynbos perspective, which is not obviously forest. And I'm sure Kirsten would also jump in here, but we dealing with the types of fuel loads that are entirely unnatural within a fynbos system. And the amount of fuel and the time with which that fuel burns, you're talking about 100 and even 200-hour fuels in some instances, when fynbos might have 10 to 50 at the absolute top hour fuels, with really old protea species. So you're talking about an entirely different type of fire that then burns within these systems with the invasive trees. And what's inherently more resilient about the fynbos is that it is developed for these areas. So, we lose not only the vegetation types, but we also lose all of the microbial life that's associated with fynbos when we have these invasive species. Some of them are allelopathic, they poison the soil essentially. And we have a real difficulty for fynbos to take hold when we've had a canopy cover and seed produced for 50 to 80 years, whether it's pine or acacia species. So in the fynbos, I think it's absolutely essential that we address it relatively quickly. And interestingly, we've had questions saying, climate change is such an issue, and the pine trees are actually storing carbon. Why don't we just leave them there? And the reality is mega fires occur, as Jason and William pointed out. What happens when you increase that density, whether it's in South Africa or in the States, is that you might have fewer fires in the interim, but when they do burn, they burn massive extensive areas, and they burn at heat intensities that are just unheard of in our areas. So it's really essential to get back to some kind of pre-infestation level.
Thank you, Matt. In 30 seconds, Will or Jason, do you have anything to add to that? Or we can move to the next question.
No, nothing to add. That was a great response from Matthew. We're happy to answer the
Amazing.
next one in the chat if that would be helpful.
Amazing.
William?
Okay. So, Morrison, this one is for you. Why do you think beneficiaries are so unwilling to pay for restoration upfront? What concerns does this output-based on finance approach address?
Yeah, a question that we get a lot is why would I pay for something that is the responsibility of the U.S. Forest Service to complete? Aren't my tax dollars already paying for this work on public lands? And that is a valid point, but when you look at the backlog of work to be done on the U.S. Forest Service land base, we need more resources in the bank to move this faster than the government can. And there's a lot of inefficiencies in that system that the FRB works to address. And one of the things we point to are as a main financing challenge that the Forest Resilience Bond works to address is the long delays in getting contractors and implementation partners paid to do this work. The way that it works in with the Forest Service, and I'm sure Jason and Will can also speak to this, is implementation partners and contractors are paid on a reimbursement basis after work is done. That means they have to put all those costs on their balance sheet, sometimes take out loans to be able to staff up, buy chainsaws, buy backhoes to do that work. The Forest Resilience Bond in this case serves as kind of a bank, low to no cost bank to these entities to be able to get that work done up front, which oftentimes means being able to get twice as much work done in a season, and working against a project plan that's a multi-year project plan. And the fact of the matter is that there is when we talk to those folks that say, why am I paying for work that's already funded, is that there's still not enough funding to do this work, even in a well-funded landscape, where we've been lucky in the past 5 years to have a lot of public funding directed toward wildfire risk reduction work. the work is still not moving fast enough to get to that scale that we need to effectively serve the problem.
Thank you, Morrison. I see some of the other questions have been answered in one way or the other, but there is, Kirsten, you have mentioned about the monitoring, and someone is asking how are you able to monitor surveillance and response to fire outbreak in such an expansive landscape?
So I think that's part of the challenge with the planning, and we definitely rely on the use of satellite imagery and remote sensing. And then the nature of our work, because it's so remote, we have to access by helicopter. So we make use of the helicopter access with repeat photography to verify what we see on the satellite imagery and then integrate that into our planning. So that's the way we can scale it up because it's not practical to physically visit every single site in your planning phase.
Thank you, Kirsten. We will look through the Q&A, and if there is more unanswered questions, we will set them together with the recording after this call. So for you to look out, please see our slides, webinar slides, because we have a few announcements. So in 30 seconds, because I see we are out of time, just to mention some of the key announcements that we have. We have a webinar on investing gaps in nature-based solution, and this will be in Spanish. So Spanish-speaking speakers are encouraged to join on the 29th. We have two new case studies from Medellin, that is Cuenca Verde and also Quito Waterford in our toolbox. Please go and review that. And a shout out that the course offered by Clanfield University on nature-based solutions for water management, for water and land management is open for applications. And I will share the slides so that you can get the links and you can be able to apply if interested. That was it all for today's call. Thank you all for joining us today. And I hope this call was useful to you as much as it was for us. And thank you to our speakers and panelists for joining us and the great presentation and the preparation work done. Hoping to see you all in our next webinar in the next quarter. Hope you have a good year ahead. Bye, everyone.